We all have these intuitions on what you do in response to a great moral wrong. Should you pursue punishment? Should you pursue truth? Should you pursue reparations? But oftentimes you don't really have a choice. Sometimes there are fundamental political conditions that limit what it is that you can do or not when you're pursuing justice. So let's start by just opening up with the question that was there. What do we mean by peace versus justice? Is it always a simple choice between the two? So, anyone want to start? Peace versus justice. What do we mean by it? Go on. Yeah, go ahead.
What's the fundamental difference of do we seek? A lot of the time it's not a clean-cut break from the former government. Often they do hold some power, normally in terms of the military force. They can be quite influential. So sort of the stability of a newly found democracy or any kind of ruling power versus seeking justice, reparations, trial, truth, sort of to appease not appease, but sort of make amends for the people that often had great human rights violations committed against them. So and that process of seeking truth can often aggravate the ex-power of the military. So it's like who wins the reparations or the seeking of peace.
Okay, fair enough. You made a good point there. You said that there is never very rarely a clean break between two regimes. We spoke the last time about two main types of transitions. Transitions from authoritarianism towards democracy or liberalisation, transitions from war to peace. But one of the things that we'll see, hopefully in this semester, as Dr. says, there isn't often a clear transition between the two. You very rarely go from a very, very straightforward case of authoritarianism straight into democracy, or from war straight into peace. There's often compromises and limitations that exist there. What does this notion of peace versus justice mean to you, Rebecca? Sorry, just after sneezing.
Well, I thought it was because you're facing the demands of the victims, because they want justice, don't they? So whether it's in like a domestic context or international human rights context, and also the government, the new government wants to have a form of legitimacy. So it's all these demands. Yet, if there's like a military regime that they've just taken over, they might feel like they want to seize power if they're too harsh on them. So they just have to balance all the considerations.
Okay, and we'll come to this notion again. It's not just, you mentioned victims, but as you say, it's not purely victims who have an interest in justice. Often governments as well, some of them may have been victims, some of them may not. They will often have an interest in justice as well, because it's a way of legitimising the regime. But oftentimes there will be other people who want to resist. You pointed out army generals. In some of the cases we look at, it was very much a case of the army not wanting to be made accountable. But again, sometimes a lot of the earlier examples, and we look at Chile, they dealt with generals and armies, but in a context of authoritarianism. But we also need to think about peace and peace agreements as well. Is it always sort of a simple sort of binary choice between the two, Ellen? Is it always like a straightforward binary choice between peace and justice, or what's your understanding of the dilemma?
Reading it says that there's a clash.
Go on. Well, go on. What do you think the clash is? Where do you, like, is it just fundamentally a case of peace versus justice? Is there a grey area? Okay, anyone? Cal, what do you think? Well, sorry, I've got hands, so I'll go back. Okay, so sorry, is it
Maria?
Maria, yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
I
Okay,
said
Maria.
it is not a simple choice between peace and justice. It will depend on the characteristics of the outgoing regime, for example, and the transitional government legitimacy. How do they want to do it? How is the relationship between the military forces and the new government, if there are any military forces? And also they have to take into account the public pressure, let's say UN, US in some cases, and also the non-governmental organizations, if they are involved in it. So it's not only like peace or justice, it's not only like considering them, the rebels, when taking the decisions, or not considering them or making them accountable for everything. So it would really depend on the context and the situation.
Okay.
I'd say that.
So it's not always. Sometimes the choice will be more straightforward or not. And again, we'll be looking at different sort of contexts matter, and hopefully we look at a few countries. We've Colombia mentioned in the thing. There will be Chile. There's other options we can look at as well, like Uganda. And hopefully we look at a few examples as we go through. But context is always very important. What were you going to say, Pippa? Was there anything different?
Building on what Ellen said on the clash of paradigms, though it's said that, you know, as we've gone forth, there's kind of an agreement, settlement between the peace and justice clash, but there's always a conflict between the norms that exist and interests of the parties. So that could be seen as the clash between peace and justice, and you can't ever pick whether you look at only the norms that exist or whether you only protect the interests. It always has to be a combination of the two.
Okay, that's a very good way of distilling sort of the debate we're going to have today. What we see in many cases a clash between norms and interests is a very good way of putting it. We have all these norms. International criminal law, again, is an example. Recognizes accountability. There's a norm of accountability for certain egregious forms of human rights abuse, like torture, like war crimes, like crimes against humanity. So they're the norms, but they always clash against interests. There's a fundamental human interest in not being put into prison. You know, if you're a person who has committed crimes, very few people go willingly towards prison because, for reasons we discussed the last day, some people think that what they did was absolutely right and they shouldn't be going to prison anyway. And there's often a compelling interest in not revealing the truth, or there's a compelling interest in not agreeing to reparations, because all of these things cost people. It costs people to go to prison, it costs people to fund reparations, it costs people to admit the truth about the past as it happened. So again, one way I suppose of how we can understand what we're talking about today is a clash between norms of accountability, of truth, of reparations, and the personal interests of various potential wrongdoers in avoiding any form of accountability or truth or reparations.
Also, this dilemma requires a new government that is still not really stable, because a new government never, especially after authoritarian times, democratic times, they're never really fully stable, because as new people, new government, it's a natural process. And it's really, I have to say that it's kind of, I'm not saying normal, but like normal for them to, because they have to balance between peace and justice. They want to please everybody, but it's never going to please everybody. And like a new government, it's a really hard job for them to kind of keep it at the beginning of actually the work. So it's never going to be like a healthy balance between those two.
Absolutely. You make an interesting point about instability. One of the things we need to remember about periods of transition from war to peace or from authoritarianism to democracy is that they're characterised by great instability. No one knows at the end of a war whether a peace will hold. Lots of peace agreements break down within 6 months or within a year. Lots of new democratising governments have failed. There's often coups and things like that. You gave the example a couple of weeks ago of Poland in 1989. Poland looks very stable now. I mean, it's had effectively, it had democratic governance for 26 or 27 years, you know, so in retrospect, you know, the transition of Poland, for example, looks very safe. But at the time they were very unsure. They had no idea whether it would endure or not. We look at Argentina and Chile, they've all been democracies now for 26 or 27 years. They look quite stable and quite safe. But at the time, people had a huge amount of uncertainty as to whether those regimes would endure or not. You can take the example of Libya after the Arab Spring, or Tunisia after the Arab Spring. They formed new democratic governments. The Tunisian government very nearly fell and was just basically barely kept together by the governing coalition. The Libyan government fell apart after a few weeks. So people are always enter into these decisions about justice on a basis of fundamental uncertainty as to whether the government will endure or whether a peace agreement will remain in place. So again, one of the things we need to be conscious of in this particular seminar is the dangers that people face, the sense of uncertainty. It's very easy for people outside the community in question to be very dogmatic about what justice options you must pursue. But we need to acknowledge that the dilemma looks very different from the point of view of people within that society at the time. Zalaquet, in his article, Zalaquet was an interesting fellow because he was on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Chile. On page 1430, he argues that democratic leaders in transitional states should be guided by an ethic of responsibility rather than by an ethic of conviction. Anyone knows what he means by that? Brian, any ideas? What he's getting at here?
Well, my understanding is that when he refers to ethics of conviction, it means the unshakable beliefs that a politician or a person holds. So it's sort of what they hold within them that helps them make decisions that they do. And then when they talk about the ethics of responsibility, it refers to the day-to-day needs that person employs to preserve peace for the greater good. But I saw a problem because it says here that democratic leaders should be guided by ethics of responsibility rather than, so it's this one rather than the other. And then in that specific section, they reference Max Weber's article. But in Max Weber's article, he specifically says that an ethic of ultimate ends, which is also what is an ethic of conviction, just referred to differently, and an ethic of responsibility are not absolute contrasts, but rather supplements. So in the
I'll come back to you for this because I think you're making an interesting point. I just want to go back to the issue of the ethic of responsibility versus conviction, but you're absolutely right, or maybe not. We go and see. Aidan, what did you make of it? I'll come back to you on that idea, Brian. But what did you make of this notion of an ethic of conviction versus an ethic of responsibility? What?
As in, what would I?
Yeah, what's your interpretation of this? And what's he getting across?
Essentially, he says that politicians ought to be guided primarily by the consequences or the predictable consequences of their actions, as opposed to sort of the intent behind what they're doing. So, sort of politicians ought to be guided by the consequences. So,
well, what sort of consequences are he talking about?
Like a social, well, he speaks in the context of Chile. So, he's talking about peace over justice, getting rid of the dictatorship without sort of any accountability for the people responsible is the greatest social good than maintaining the dictatorship.
Okay, but in Chile it wasn't really an issue of maintaining the dictatorship. The dictatorship was moving out of power. The incoming democratising government had a choice to make, but he's arguing that here that that incoming government had this choice between an ethic of consequences and an ethic of responsibility. And I think Brian hit the nail on the head when he was talking about it, but I'm just interested in teasing this notion out a little bit further. Mandana, what do you understand as the difference between an ethic of conviction and an ethic of responsibility?
I think it comes down to the situation at hand and the countries involved, depending on which country you look at, and the political stability within that country, because it's... I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say. I think it's the whole idea of having to learn from past mistakes and ensure that those past mistakes are not made again, and so having the responsibility of that to carry that out and ensure that the protection of civilians is maintained in the future.
Okay, protection of civilians from what though?
So, for example, if there's been previous regimes where ethnic cleansing has been carried out, the new regime that's come in ensure that the same mistakes that allowed that to happen don't get carried out again.
Okay, I wouldn't really say that's what's going. That's more in terms of an ethic of conviction. As Brian was saying earlier, in these types of cases you have, in one sense you have an ethic of conviction, an ethic of a strong belief, often guided by norms, that certain types of offences must be punished. So what Zalaquet was saying that in Chile, like in many countries, when the transition was happening, there were strong groups of people, often victims or new members of the government, who had this strong ethic of conviction that certain abuses from the past that were committed by the military regime must be punished. Okay, so the regime in Chile, for example, it was Pinochet. There was a situation of children being stolen from their parents, of people being executed and tortured in the national football stadium, enforced disappearances, detention without trial. Lots of things that we would consider to be either breaches of the domestic constitution in Chile or breaches of international law. So some people in Chile have this ethic of conviction that these abuses must be punished. You can't really ground a human rights-based regime or democracy in Chile unless these things are punished. And that's kind of what you were getting at, Mandela, in the sense that there is this notion that you have to punish these things in case they happen again. But this would be more an ethic of conviction rather than an ethic of responsibility. The ethic of responsibility, then, as Brian was saying, means something sort of fundamentally different. You shouldn't begin from the position that crimes must necessarily be punished. You need to bear in mind the predictable consequences of that. So if it was the case in Chile that if the government pushed too hard for prosecutions in that particular country, there was a real likelihood that the military regime would have overthrown the democratic government. I mentioned a quote in the sheet for this seminar. General Pinochet said, "Touch one hair on the head of my generals and you lose your new democracy." He suggested very strongly that if there was any process of accountability, genuine criminal accountability in Chile for him or for his soldiers, he would reverse the transition towards democracy. Because ultimately, it was something that he had agreed to. He had agreed to have a referendum on democratization. Most of the Latin American transitions were handovers of power. Power wasn't seized by democratizers, it was handed over by military regimes. So here we see this clash between an ethic of conviction, that the generals must be punished, versus an ethic of responsibility. Political leaders who are thinking about the likely consequences of what would happen if punishment resulted. But Brian, you find this to be a sort of a false binary. You're not convinced by it.
Yeah. Well, just purely because Zalakat says that democratic leaders should be guided by an ethic of responsibility, which is being mindful of the consequences, rather than an ethic of conviction. But if you are looking to achieve peace by looking at the consequences of what has happened, then there should be a hybrid between that and sort of an ethic of conviction, or the unshakable beliefs that you have, or the punishment for injustices or for violations that have happened in the past. Because I think what we've been talking about, for me right now, it seems that it's a case of peace versus justice. When you say an ethic of responsibility as opposed to an ethic of peace, essentially peace versus justice. But then I don't know if that's necessarily the greatest or the best form to pursue in a transitional democracy. Rather, if there is peace at the expense of justice, there is still going to be polarization in the communities or in that particular state, because there will be a sense of perpetrators of human rights violations in the past are still either at large or sort of no form of justice has come to them. So for me, I wouldn't say it's an either or, and as Max Weber says, that an ethic of ultimate ends or conviction and an ethic of responsibility are not absolute contrasts, but rather supplement each other, which only in unison constitute a genuine politician.
Yeah, so perhaps the binary as it is being presented is overly schematic or overly dramatized. It's actually a much more process of give and take, of compromising between the two notions, rather than having an absolute ethic of conviction or an absolute ethic of responsibility. Am I summarizing it? I feel like I'm grossly simplifying your more nuanced
But it's also hazy in my head, so I don't know.
No, okay. Darton, you're
Yeah, I'm just going to draw attention to Weber's quote that an ethic of responsibility does not imply a lack of conviction, just as an ethic of conviction does not imply a lack of responsibility. And I think that's what Brian was.
Yeah. Okay.
In a sense that they're not complete polar opposites. It's just being mindful of the factors around it. Rather than mixing themselves, it's just a balance.
Okay, and we do start to see a balancing act in Chile. In Chile, for example, there was a truth commission that did investigate an awful lot of the crimes that occurred there. There was reparations. So arguably we see a balance here between an ethic of conviction and an ethic of responsibility. There is an ethic of conviction in the sense that you can't have absolute impunity, you can't brush all these crimes under the carpet. There must be some form of accountability that we saw in our Truth Commission, but the democratising forces at the time weren't willing to push it all the way and to try and secure convictions at the time. Now, this isn't really in the things that you were reading, but over time actually there's been quite a lot of criminal accountability in Chile. It just waited another 10 or 11 or 12 years. After 2 or 3 election cycles, lots of generals had died or moved out of their positions. Democracy was becoming much firmer established. And from the mid-noughties onwards, we've seen quite a few trials of figures who were involved in the military junta in Chile. The same has happened in Argentina and to a lesser extent Paraguay and Guatemala. So again, sometimes people show more deference towards this ethic of responsibility. They hold back a little bit in terms of accountability. But what we do find sometimes is that when societies stabilise, they have greater freedom to go and pursue accountability. Was the compromise that Zalaquet described in Chile acceptable? Ruth, what do you...
I think that, like in an idealistic world, they would have been able to be prosecuted straight away, and people would have been named, and everyone, like the victims, would have found out what happened and been able to see justice happen. But I think, as they were kind of trying to learn what happened with other countries, I kind of see it as acceptable because, like you just said, if the country is still so unstable, if you are to prosecute, if you are to do these things, then it can really jeopardise that. And so I think it's acceptable for it not to happen until later on, and the main focus to be on making that state more stable, making the victims hear what actually happened, because I think the truth can be quite healing for them.
Okay. Anyone disagree? Anyone find that they got the balance wrong in Chile? Everyone's kind of sort of happy with the way things worked out. Arguably they did. Chile is now a stable democracy. There was a degree of truth. There's been lots and lots of accountability since. It's very hard to argue that they got it wrong there. But at the time, many people were disappointed at the fact there wasn't going to be any criminal accountability for what happened there. They felt that people like José Zalaquet had been far too cautious. Yeah.
Was there any potential for sort of outside influences to
Not-
any sort of pressure on the...
Not really at the time. I mean, as we were saying last time, this was around 1990 or 1991, at the end of the Cold War. But there still wasn't this thrust towards internationalisation. You see the international criminal tribunals and the ICC and things like that. The international human rights NGOs were only really kicking into gear at the time. There wasn't really the same degree of interest and accountability that we'd see now. Nowadays, if you go on to Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch online, people are saying there needs to be accountability for Syria, there needs to be accountability for Libya, for Tunisia, for Ukraine, etc., etc. That wasn't really the case back then. So there wasn't the same degree of international pressure for convictions. But there was an awful lot of uncertainty. So you ended up having lots of conferences and people talking to each other, wondering about what to do in these types of situations. And that's where we see the birth of transitional justice as a concept. Nowadays it would be very different. There would be UN commissions, there'd be special rapporteurs, there'd be organised human rights campaigns to put pressure on the Chilean government to go and prosecute. There's still no guarantee that pressure would actually have ended up in prosecutions, but there would certainly be more pressure now than there was then.
So how would you classify the accountability in Chile's case then? Would you say like it's okay? Because I feel kind of dissatisfaction after reading that they only had the Truth Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they didn't really went.
Well, they did. I mean, subsequently, long after this article, after the Truth Commission, there were, as I was saying, quite a lot of criminal prosecutions. But that was 10 or 15 years afterwards, when there were a whole new generation of judges. Lots of the senior military figures had died off or had retired, when the government was very, very stable. Chile's one of the countries that's actually had the most accountability, the most thoroughgoing transitional justice ever. Because there was Truth Commissions, there were reparations, and there was ultimately some criminal accountability. Which again tends to show that maybe you're better off being slow and cautious about these things. And sometimes there's sort of a tortoise and a hare type dynamic in these sorts of countries. It's better to go slow and steady than perhaps quickly and in a destabilising fashion. Any questions or any points?
It took about amnesty. Was that amnesty enacted by the military government? So it's a bit interesting that even following the military government's collapse, that was still held to be constitutional.
Well, absolutely. The government, the Pinochet government passed an amnesty for itself in the early 80s. They basically passed a law saying anything that we have done is amnestied in the past and forthwith. So one of the
that was still upheld even going forward into the new.
It was still upheld because the government in Chile, the judiciary was still filled with appointees from the Pinochet regime, so they would be less likely to fight it anyway. The government weren't really keen to push the matter because they feared a coup by the government, because the armed forces were still very, very strong. But yeah, this whole discussion happened in the context of a self-amnesty by the government. By the mid-noughties, around 2003 or 4, the Chilean Supreme Court had said this amnesty is in breach of international law and cannot be applied. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights had also said that these sorts of amnesties can't apply, but it took time. So yeah, the self-amnesty passed by the government usually was maintained in place. And a lot of these arguments that we're having, a lot of this peace versus justice debate happens in the context of an amnesty that's passed either by an authoritarian government for all its own actions or as part of a peace agreement. And we look at that issue as well when we come to power sharing and things like that. Okay, what does Scar mean when she argues the government's choice of human rights policy largely depends on the relative strength of the public's demand for truth and justice and the outgoing regime's demand for amnesty and impunity? No idea? Again, there's no point in coming to the seminars unless you're prepared and you've done the reading. Jess, what do you understand by this?
I think what she's trying to say is like that basically just that if the people are more inclined towards a certain route for like transitional justice to take. So if they're more inclined for like the truth and they want more of this, then they're more likely to walk towards an amnesty route than if the people are saying they want to have criminal prosecutions, then they might be more inclined to lean towards that because then they have the backing of the people. At least that's what I.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I identified that the transitional government has 5 essential goals to pursue. So in this sense,
we're not necessarily talking about the government at the moment, though. We're talking about the people, like, in inverted commas, and the outgoing regime.
In order for the transitional government to pursue these goals, they have to take a decision of whether they are taking the option of trials, truth commission, or doing nothing.
Okay.
So it will depend on the public demand.
Okay.
And also how the outgoing regime is working. If they still have military control, or they can seek for impunity for the past crimes, then the transitional government will do nothing because they don't want to risk their stability, as we were saying before. And after that, if the public demand is quite strong, then they might go for a trial. And if that is quite equal, then we can look for a truth commission. So I would say that in this sense, the policy is going to depend on the context of the outgoing regime and the public pressure as well.
Okay. All right. Very good.
I was just thinking about how there probably might be still large sections of the public that might actually, especially in societies that might have ethnic divisions or sectarian divisions, then you might have your incoming government, but the old outgoing government might represent a different ethnic group. So there might still be actually a large section of society that may still support that big old regime versus kind of balancing.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the things, we talk about the people and their demand for accountability, but it's important to remember that in most divided societies, there will be people who are greatly prejudiced by the war or by repression. There are people who actually support the war, the divisions, the repression, and there'll be a large, possibly the largest number of people who are fundamentally indifferent one way or the other as to what is done. Case in point is Northern Ireland. In the late 90s, there were Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland who this idea of notion of accountability and pardons was the most important pressing concern in society at the time. you know people in England and Wales and Scotland, for example, who had no idea whatsoever was going on. But of course they made up the majority of the population in Britain at the time. So you have that all the time. We can talk quite schematically about the people, and Scar maybe does this in her article, but in actual fact, it's very rare to be able to say that the people think and speak and believe as one. Was there a Vibha?
Couple of points. Firstly, the transition is not always from an authoritarian regime to democracy.
Yes,
So-
we are sort of getting trapped in this sort of language as well, but you're right, yes.
So, while we look at it as a shift in kind of governance, new interim governments may also be authoritarian in nature and not necessarily want to take up certain actions at the risk of losing certain other benefits that they have with the previous government that was in power. And secondly, it's been argued that unless there's a complete total fall of a complete regime crash, it's not possible to have a truth commission or any form of transitional justice. So while it's not true that there needs to be a complete fall, there's also this element of military control and certain authorities, maybe in lower levels of public office, but that repeat from the previous government, that carry on from the previous government to the new government. So there is not a possibility of being able to punish all of them versus
Okay, you made two points there. The first one in particular is very important. You said we're not just talking about authoritarian regimes, and that's an important thing to bear in mind. I hopefully you notice there's a big distinction between Srier and Van de Ginsta, their article, which deals with peace agreements, and Zalakat's article, or Scar, who are talking more about post-authoritarian transitions. Because usually at the end of a war, it's often the same government that's in place. Usually, in most civil wars, the government usually wins. And they have a peace agreement, but there isn't really a fundamental change in the nature of government. There's just a fundamental change in the nature of the state. It goes from being a state at war to a state at peace. So again, we need to be careful when we're engaging with the terminology that's there. This notion of a clean break and things is something I'll come back to in a second. What about the role of the government? Scar is talking here about a balance between the people, victims' organisations, human rights organisations, and the outgoing regime. What's the role of the government in these types of situations? Any ideas, Charlotte? We've got...
Is this question 4?
It is, yeah.
4.
4, yes. Isn't it 4? I think it is. Yes, question 4. So, Scar is talking here about the public and the pressure that it can bring to bear. Let's assume that the general public is generally supportive of accountability or truth. You have the outgoing regime who don't want to do anything. What's the position of the government in these types of situations?
I think the government will want to kind of raise support for their policy, so that they should be more leaning towards providing justice as opposed to granting amnesty.
Okay, so you think the government should be more inclined towards justice than the granting of amnesty. Okay, but I suppose what we need to bear in mind, I suppose, they're all sort of caught somewhere between victims and the public and the outgoing regime. They're sort of the factor, the group that's mediating between the demands of the two. The demand of the outgoing regime is for impunity, the demand of the general public, let's assume, is for accountability. Ultimately, that decision will normally rest with the domestic government, and they're in the process of sort of mediating these two demands, trying to reconcile them. Sometimes they can't.
From what I've understood, where the two parties, or the two camps clash, the government will always prioritise survival, so they will side with whoever has the more pull and the more power. Like some things the previous regime is quite weak, they don't possess much of a threat, then they will pursue justice because that's, their survival rests on the support of
the people.
and obviously vice versa, if the previous government poses a threat, that's fine for them because they're just about it.
Okay, absolutely. The argument here is that, okay, there's obviously a fear that outgoing regimes can destabilise the country, or they can overturn democracy, or they can end the peace by reassuming their weapons and going back to war, which is one set of pressure that's on a government. But the public place an enormous degree of pressure on the government as well, because one of the arguments is that it fundamentally calls into question the legitimacy of the government. If it's completely unwilling to address the past, it's very open to the people to just reject the legitimacy of that government and say, you're no different to what went before, you don't stand for our rights, you don't stand up for our interests. So there's a possibility that the government can be voted out of power in a few years if they don't meet domestic demand for justice, or to the extent that they drag their feet, there's a possibility that they won't be able to get anything else done anyway, because there'll be such a lack of faith in them. The other argument as well, of course, is that you need to do something about the old regime while they're around and available to influence public opinion or to put pressure on the government. It's impossible to have a meaningful democracy.
To build on that as well, that's where the Truth Commissions come in.
Go on.
Because it says here, the Truth Commissions are the most likely outcome when the relative strength of the conflicting demands is roughly equal. Because in a way it appears to give recognition to the injustices of the past, whilst also not really doing much and not really holding the previous government and stuff. You know, it's not trial, it's not sanction, it's just a slap on the wrist and what's better.
Okay, do you say appeasement?
It sort of appeases both parties because it's recognition, but it also doesn't really do anything.
Yeah, but there is this notion that truth commissions are at least emerged as one of the ways to reconcile these competing demands, that they in some way guaranteed some form of accountability that the general public could accept. And we certainly see elements of that in Chile and South Africa. But they also gave something to the outgoing regime. They guaranteed that while there would be some discussion and condemnation of what went on in the past, it wouldn't ultimately have the consequence of sending people to prison or imposing enormous fines on them. Now, when we start looking at truth commissions later in the semester, hopefully we'll see that there are better normative arguments for truth commissions, that there are strong moral arguments and they're not merely appeasement. But certainly in the case of Chile and some of the earlier truth commissions, there was certainly an element of trying to, they were the product of compromise between the two contrasting positions. So again, she divides accountability into three people: the domestic government, the people, and the outgoing regime. Arguably, that's now a four-sided thing. The international community is a much stronger factor in these types of decisions than they were when Scar was writing this article. So you can argue now that possibly there's a balance between the people, the government, the international community, and the outgoing regime. And the international community and the people are often allies with each other. But ultimately, it doesn't change. It may not change all that much in terms of outcomes or results. Okay, let's move on to question. Let's look very quickly at question 5. Scar and Sriram talk about strong and weak outgoing regimes and strong and weak incoming regimes. Payne, Olsen and Reiter talk about a clean break with the past. What do they mean, Cal? What are they trying to get at here?
Well, it's about the power of the regime. I mean, a clean break with the past is essentially denying anything happened anyway. It's peace instead of justice. So if...
I wouldn't say that now. I think what people mean by clean break with the past is the old regime are fundamentally very, very weak, and there's arguably a greater opportunity.
It works on both sides. If the old regime is strong, then they're saying, well, if the old regime is strong and it's moving out of power slowly, they're saying, well, we need to move on, we need to forget about these things, and what they're saying is we still got our hands on the levers of power, and we're not going to prosecute our own people or the army, like Pinochet was saying, don't touch your head on the head. But if the incoming regime is saying we need a clean break from the past, that shows how weak they are, and they understand that. They don't have power, really. This is just a figure.
Well, I mean, in almost all situations we're talking about, there really is a transition power. There is some sort of meaningful transition. The question is whether it's a clean break where, again, the old regime don't have any hands at all on the levers of power, or if you've got a situation where they've still got quite a few of their muddy paws on the levers.
A clean break doesn't give justice.
Sorry?
A clean break doesn't give justice.
Okay, but the argument is that the cleaner the break, the better the chances for justice. I'll go David there.
Isn't it decided whether the old regime has been defeated or collapsed?
Okay, yes,
or whether it's more sort of a negotiated transfer of power.
Absolutely.
So when the old regimes have been completely defeated or collapsed, then they're in a weak position, and the new government's in a strong position, so they can direct the transition, as it were, and they've got more power in a way.
Absolutely.
To create a clean break in the past.
You're getting towards this notion of a clean break. Absolutely. Can you think of any examples of a clean break or where this might have happened? Chile clearly isn't. Go on, Aidan.
After wars,
Okay, go on.
so when the government's completely collapsed and been defeated by rebels or...
Okay, absolutely. Any examples though? Any?
I don't know, just Cuban Revolution.
Cuban Revolution? Yeah, arguably. Well, a lot of people fled by that stage. There was firing squads. There wasn't necessarily trials, but yeah, Castro overthrew Batista. Yeah, I think that was slightly more kangaroo courts than most of what we're talking about here, and massive executions, and most people fled the country. But the Cuban Revolution is a decent enough example. World War II, fundamental defeat of the Nazis, so opened up the possibility for accountability. We will start looking next week with Alex. I think you're going to start looking at the trials in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. They're both examples of very, very thorough transition justice because there was a clean break with the past. In the Balkan Wars, ultimately the NATO, the United States were able to go in, effectively topple the regime of Slobodan Milosevic, and ultimately he and lots of other Bosnian Serbs were handed over, and Serbs and Bosnian Serbs were handed over to the ad hoc tribunal in The Hague because they'd been fundamentally defeated. In Rwanda, the Tutsi army overthrew the Hutu government, and there was very, very thorough accountability in Rwanda because, again, there was this complete break with the past. The old government there was no negotiations, they were defeated in the course of war, and there was very, very thorough justice there. So again, war is a good example of places where there's a clean break with the past. In Argentina, after the Argentinian government lost the Falklands War with Britain, the government were utterly discredited. They knew they had to give up power, and they were very, very unpopular. And people in Argentina thought this was a clean break because the government were so discredited. They handed over power to the democratizing forces. And the Argentinian government tried to have trials because they thought they had the freedom and the power to do so. But ultimately the army began to fight back. So that's a good example of a place that's in between the two. But as David says, one of the key distinctions we need to look out for are negotiated transitions and those that happen as a result of a clean break, as a result of a victory or not. Darty, did you have your hands up before I was talking to David?
I was going to say it's kind of clean break versus negotiation. So
absolutely. That is one of the key distinctions that we are going to look at. To the extent that transition is negotiated between people who committed human rights abuses and people who didn't, then those negotiations, part of the quid pro quo, will always be some measure of impunity or some measure of accountability. Again, the end of the apartheid regime, for example, is a good example of it. Or the example of Kenya, that I think Brian was talking about a few weeks ago. I mean, part of the negotiations about re-establishing a functional democracy in Kenya was some measure of impunity in that particular country. When I was doing my PhD, I did East Timor. That was a case of a very clean break. The Indonesians were more or less booted out of East Timor, and those that were left had no political power whatsoever, and there was very thorough accountability there. Sierra Leone is another example. There was a civil war. Two of the factions were defeated. The other faction was entirely reliant on the international community, and so there was very strong forms of accountability there. So again, you'll come across some of these examples the more you read through the module, but the book by Olsen, Payne and Reiter is actually quite good in terms of examples. Does anyone have any questions on this notion of a clean break and negotiation? People fundamentally clear? All right. Kaya, Olsen, Payne and Reiter identified key factors that impair and promote accountability. What are they?
I'm not sure if it's the right answer, but I just want the factors affecting the accountability.
Go, say it again.
Factors affecting the accountability.
Yes.
Is the intensity of abuses in conflict.
Okay.
And human rights abuses, then civil and relation between the military and civil sectors. And international factors also from outside.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there are three factors: the intensity and scale, I suppose, and duration of the abuses, the relationship between the going out, the people giving up power and people assuming it, which we've talked about a lot. International factors. Anything else?
Could you say the timing of the transition?
Go on.
So if the abuses were committed at sort of a long time before the transition, then accountability would be less likely.
Yep, that's absolutely timing of abuses, no doubt. Charlotte?
The duration of the regime,
Go on.
in the sense, the longer the regime, the less likely it is they are to pursue trials and prosecutions.
Okay.
The more likely to grant amnesty.
Absolutely. Why? Why is duration important? You're right, but there's a reason why. Why would it matter if it, why would a government that's been in power for 30 years be more likely to avoid accountability than one that was in power for a year? Ideas? Okay.
Because, like, for example, when was, again, coming back to the example of Poland, the previous government, the communist government, you can see, like, older people now in Poland say, oh, but the older government was much better than the democratic one. It's like, they just kind of got used to it. That's why they kind of could get away with something, because people kind of, like, started to, maybe not like the government, but just they got used to this kind of government. And now they went through the change to the democratic government that gave them some things, but took away the other ones. And they're like, no, it was better before.
Okay, so the fact that a lot of people over time have accommodated themselves to a certain form of government, yeah, that certainly will have an impact.
I would say it has to do with sort of reminiscent of the old times, more the fact that it permeates different sort of layers of the judiciary and so on. There's people left behind that would be kind of in charge of enforcing accountability.
Yes, I think that's the big one. I mean, Kaya, you're certainly right in the sense that if a government has been around for 30, 40 years, they're not going to be sort of showing Donald Trump levels of incompetence every single week. They're going to do some good things, so they're going to have some degree of support within the community. But the other point is, Dart, is that if you're in power for 30 years, you basically get to permeate the whole civil service, you get to permeate the whole court and judicial system. So basically you own accountability within that state. It's very hard to progress against a government that's been in power for a very, very long time, because they appoint all the judges, they appoint all the police, they appoint all of the civil servants. So again, lots of these things will affect how thorough accountability can be. It's just a good idea just to be aware of all of these. One of the things I'll probably do with the dissertation, I need to discuss this with Alex, but I often give people an opportunity to just discuss one country in particular if they want to go and do so. And if you were to go down that route and look at a single country when you're doing these things, or if you were to go and look at a single country in the course of writing your coursework assessment, these are the sort of things that you need to be aware of. You know, what are the broader contextual factors that affect a state and their accountability decisions? Okay. What factors affect the amount of public pressure for accountability for human rights abusers? Who'll I begin? Rebecca.
I think it's whether there's a shared ethnic, linguistic background and society is not fractionalised. Because I think that if there's homogeneity between society, then they'll want to prosecute, they'll want to hold someone to justice. But if there's differences, you're not going to identify with the victim, so it lessens the pressure. Okay, very good. That's certainly one of the absolute main factors. The degree of ethnic fractionalisation, how divided a society is, will have a fundamental impact on the willingness to secure accountability. Can you give me any examples or any places where this has been at issue? I think, like you said before, like Yugoslavia, Serbia, the Kosovos and stuff. But that did lead to it, obviously. But I think that society was highly fractionalised. Okay. Yeah. Best example is probably the Balkans. Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia. After the war occurred in Bosnia, there was trials at The Hague and there were some domestic trials as well. And one thing every single
public survey shows is that Croatians are great believers in accountability for Serbs or for Bosnian Muslims, but they absolutely reject the idea that any people from their community should be punished. Likewise, Bosnian Serbs greet any prosecution of a Croat or a Bosnian Muslim with great enthusiasm, but again, they utterly reject the notion that anyone from their community should be punished. So often in divided societies, Sri Lanka, for example, again, you will find there's a division there between Sinhalese and Tamils. Tamils are very much in favour of accountability for the Sinhalese government's abuses against them, but not so much in favour of being prosecuted for their own abuses, and vice versa. So absolutely one of the core things that influences the amount of public pressure or public support for prosecutions is the homogeneity or heterogeneity of the society that is there, how united they can be behind a policy. So that's certainly one thing that is influential. Anything else?
I would say if there are possible channels that the public can apply or can put forward their pressure for accountability, and channels can take the form of, for example, conveners or representative of the people, such as community-based organizations or intervention of the international community to act as a channel to sort of galvanize that pressure from the public. There have been contexts where there wasn't such a channel, for example, in Somalia, where there isn't a strong presence of community organizations. So there really isn't any public pressure just because there's no avenue channels to get public pressure to the channel.
Okay, absolutely. We talk about the people as this very sort of disembodied notion, but there really is no such thing in a way. Like the public can only articulate an argument for justice or for impunity or for human rights or whatever through organisations. So one of the things that we see that is one of the main engines for securing accountability is the fact that the people are organised into things like human rights organisations, into victim organisations or survivor organisations. If they can effectively leverage those voices with political parties or with issues of like democratising groups and things like that. So again, one of the key factors will be the existence of civil society, the existence of human rights organisations. As Brian says, the international community can be very important because where there isn't any domestic civil society, arguably the international community can come in and work, set up offices, set up projects and things like that. That's often why it's really important that things like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International get involved in accountability, because otherwise people will certainly want justice, but they may not have the avenues to pursue it. Somalia is a good example of a place where civil society is very, very weak. Again, it's worth bearing in mind that there's been nothing like a transition in Somalia for a long time. There's possibly one going to occur now, but of course you need that sort of that opportunity, political upheaval in the form of a transition and some form of organisation between the people. That's one of the things that Scar talks about in her article. Anything else that influences?
Could you say whether the country has a democratic past before the rule of the authoritarian rule?
Go on.
And whether there were institutions in place beforehand, democratic institutions, so there was some form of accountability for, say, politicians and things before.
Absolutely. Well, this is one of the things that people saw in Latin America in particular. A lot of countries there used to be democracies with a functioning rule of law, or at least a semi-functioning rule of law, or some forms of accountability. So it felt more natural to go and appeal for forms of accountability. It's one of the reasons why impunity was such a problem in Eastern Europe, because you had Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, all at some point in their history had functioning governments and had the rule of law and had norms of accountability. And people were very angry that they couldn't go back to these sorts of pre-existing norms. But if a country was ever democratic or had a tradition of the rule of law before, it's often much easier to get public support for criminal prosecutions because it's something that's sort of inherent to the political culture of that state.
I also mentioned in these kind of cases when the democratic government or rule of law existed before, then there was a big break and then another transition time. It also, like not all, but like mostly depends on the society, because if the society is strong, if the society, for example, in the time of crisis, is still trying to like put everything together, it actually depends a lot on the society. Because Polish society at that point was pretty strong, even despite the fact that it was after like World War II that it was really affected by. The society was strong, was ready for change.
But it still wasn't able to turn that into prosecutions, though. I mean, lots of things changed in Poland, but even in Poland, where you say civil society was very, very strong, there still wasn't an effective campaign for criminal prosecutions because it was thought to be too dangerous.
But
So,
I think because of that, change is possible. The change itself, from the authoritarian to the democratic governments.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. But it is often strange sometimes how regimes can be comprehensively overturned, and yet the people, even though the civil society in and of itself, it won't be enough without other supporting factors to go and guarantee accountability. But you're right, Aidan, I mean, a pre-existing sort of tradition of democracy or the rule of law makes it more likely. It doesn't guarantee it, but it does make it a little more likely.
I think that one other factor that could increase the amount of public pressure for accountability is that if there was a minority government ruling over another ethnic majority, and this was the defaulting government, and then in that case, the want for justice increases because it was the majority population that was affected.
Go on, can you give me examples? I think I follow you.
Yeah, like for example, Syria.
Go on, yes.
Right? You have a small Muslim minority sect, which is Assad's government, ruling over a majority sect, which is not a Sunni majority.
So Assad's government is Shia Alawites,
exactly.
they're a small...
There is Shia Alawites, it's a small community.
Yeah.
So it might gather more public support even in terms of them being a majority being dominated by a minority government.
Okay, but like Syria is a place where there almost certainly won't be any accountability whatsoever, particularly for
At
government.
this point, like looking at it now, definitely not, but like in other situations that could account to people, that building up pressure. Because in a lot of places in the Middle East and in parts of Asia, like internally, there are places where a lot of majority governments are, a lot of majority population is ruled by a minority-oriented government.
Mm-hmm.
Like for example, there has been no justice with regard to Kashmir, but Kashmir was annexed into India because it had a Hindu ruler, even though it had a Muslim majority, and by that logic should have gone to Pakistan during the separation.
Okay, but again, that's
why it still remains to be in conflict and people are pushing for a referendum.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It'd be interesting I take your point. It's just an unusual set of circumstances where they're there. But obviously, if you have a majority of the population whose wishes clearly have not been given effect in the past, they are always going to be very likely to campaign for accountability. That'll also be very threatening to the government that's in place, which gives them a very strong motivation to resist. Absolutely. Okay. Let's move on to this notion of power sharing in peace negotiations. A lot of the discussion so far, particularly in relation to Chile and the SCAR article, has dealt with authoritarian regimes. But war raises some different dilemmas. We're not talking about a transition from one type of government to the other. Often there's a fair degree of continuity between governments, but there is a fundamental change in society between peace and war. So, what do we mean? Let's start with this whole notion of power sharing, because most civil wars, the overwhelming majority of civil wars these days end with power sharing agreements. So, Mandana, what do we mean by power sharing agreements? What are we talking about here?
What is in the actual...
Yeah, what's your
power sharing agreements?
What's your understanding of power sharing?
So if it's in the context of civil wars, balance of power between the relevant parties to ensure a peaceful time following a period of conflict.
Okay, how do they do that? Why is power sharing thought to be a good way of ending conflict or guaranteeing peace?
Because you can have all the relevant parties sit down and actually have a discussion about what they want to be carried out, and then make the compromises to ensure that, to some extent, every person can be made happy.
Okay, yeah, or at least not unhappy, but yeah, I see where you're going. Anyone else? Anyone else will start with a different interpretation of power sharing? Do you have any? Oh, Cal, go on.
I say there's like a home parliament.
Okay, go on.
When we have two parties that we've moved into democracy, and yet the divisions are still so apparent that there's no one overall leading ruling party.
Okay, that's not exactly what power sharing is, but this notion of a hung parliament is kind of getting in that sort of direction. The thing to bear in mind about most civil wars, you look at Syria, the Syrian civil war was won by the Syrian government quite recently, but 2 or 3 years ago people didn't think they were going to win, and the war seemed to be just going on forever and ever and ever. And most conflicts are like that. We're going to look at the Colombia example in a second, but that war has effectively gone on for 40 years. It's very, very hard to win some wars because rebels and armies never fight on a battlefield. If you're rebels or you're guerrillas, you hide in the mountains, you can't be found, you come down, you shoot some soldiers, you run away again. It's very hard in modern wars for a government to actually win, and that's why we see so many wars that just last forever. So because it's very hard for rebels can never really defeat governments, and governments find it very hard to defeat rebels. There often comes to be sort of an understanding that we need to end the war because both parties realise they can't win, and we call it sort of a mutually hurting stalemate. The parties to a war realise that they can't win, there's effectively a stalemate. And part of the way that the international community and domestic groups come together to deal with conflicts that have no apparent end is to have power sharing agreements. And as Mendana was saying, the whole notion of power sharing agreements is to get different communities and bring them into government. So what you'll often see is that the executive of a state will be divided between the parties to a government. For example, in the Sierra Leonean civil war, there were loads of different power sharing agreements, but the whole idea was to bring in all three factions into government. And you divide up ministries. One faction would have the presidency, and the other parties would have vice presidencies. Or one party would be the prime minister, and another ethnic faction would have control of the Ministry of Finance or control of the mines and things like that. Sometimes they'll have military power sharing, which means that an army which used to have one ethnicity now has 2 or 3 different ethnicities. Sometimes there'll be territorial power sharing, which means that people like, let's say, Tamils in Sri Lanka could have their own ethnic homeland, which they could administer themselves, and things like that. In Northern Ireland, there's a power sharing agreement between Catholics and Protestants. In Bosnia, there is power sharing between Croatians and Serbians and Bosnian Muslims. In Colombia, we'll come to Colombia, I suppose, in a second, but you can kind of...
Could you point out that in Northern Ireland, actually, early attempts at power sharing actually fueled more violence?
Well, arguably, I mean, the failure of it is, in the early 70s, the British government tried to introduce power sharing. It was rejected by Ian Paisley, one of the more extreme Protestant factions, and then the IRA just started, again, fighting again for 20 years. But that's power sharing that didn't work. You often need 2 or 3 or 4 bites of the cherry before power sharing.
There was plenty of agreements that plans of agreements that failed and sort of incited more violence until only recently.
Absolutely. Liberia, Angola, all these countries have tried to have sort of power sharing agreements in the past. But once they do, they are sort of, once they actually reflect some of the interests of parties, they're actually quite a popular way of ending contemporary civil wars. International mediators come in and try and assist in negotiations. But that brings us to the question that we have here. How does accountability affect power sharing arrangements in peace negotiations? Or you could flip the question around. How do power sharing arrangements affect accountability? Brian?
I was just thinking right now that the question makes much more sense if it's flipped around.
It does make more sense.
But I feel like...
I was very sleepy then. Go on.
I feel like power sharing agreements greatly hinder accountability. And that is because power sharing agreements, by their very nature, they cement the power of individuals who are responsible for a lot of human rights violations, and cement that power in different levels of government and at different levels of government, such that if an international community was to come in and try and seek accountability for human rights violations, once the power has been cemented in executive government, it becomes a question of state sovereignty and a question of political integrity. So it becomes very difficult to hold people accountable once they're in power in a power sharing agreement. A classical example was in Kenya in 2007-2008, after the post-election violence. There was a power sharing agreement where one party was the president and another party was the prime minister. Now, it goes without saying that either parties had heavy involvement in the violence that ensued, but there wasn't any accountability that was leveled against them because they were in the highest forms of executive government in that country. So I would be of the personal opinion that power sharing agreements greatly hinder accountability.
Okay, absolutely.
Well, moving by the question, how it affects power sharing agreements.
I think we established the question
Right,
should be
how power sharing agreements
affect accountability.
affect accountability. At the end of the day, it brings us back to the peace versus, norms of accountability versus personal interest, that entire peace versus justice argument again. And it's important to look at long-term, like what happens in the long term as opposed to short-term repercussions of this. So if there's a power sharing agreement in place, like for example in Sri Lanka, like the Tamils and with the issue of the Tamils, it's been a lot more peaceful since then. Though there's not been accountability on both sides. But at the end of the day, it's a more peaceful situation, and in the long run, maybe that's a better alternative to holding somebody accountable.
Okay, go on.
From the reading, they say that there are two ways in which power sharing can affect accountability.
Okay, good. I love it when people start by saying, from the reading. That's why I put it there. Yes, go on.
Sorry. The first one is that the inclusion of foreign fighters, so both from state and non-states, it would allow them to effectively shield themselves against future attempts to impose accountability.
Okay.
And the second one is that if they control security, that could allow them not only to prevent accountability, but also to continue with ongoing abuses in areas that they are controlling.
Okay, so again, the point you're making is very similar to the one that Brian is making as well. It's the real core of this clash of paradigms that Van against Ed Sreer were talking about in their article. When you have a power sharing agreement, as Brian says, as you were mentioning, they usually bring together wrongdoers. Okay, it's always the leader of factions, the people who ultimately have responsibility for commanding the commission of abuses. So if you're bringing together the leaders of the government and the leader of rebel factions into a government, all of them will ultimately have some responsibility for crimes that were committed because they were either the commanders or they were the political bosses of the commanders that committed crimes. So in most power sharing agreements, every single person sitting in that room negotiating the power sharing agreement is probably complicit to some extent in some forms of human rights abuses, and in theory at least could be accountable for some of the crimes that they have committed. However, if you do join a power sharing agreement, you get an enormous amount of power, and that power gives you the ability to resist any form of accountability. So often there will be an implicit quid pro quo. You not only, if you give up your weapons, you get power, you also get to enjoy impunity for crimes that are committed against you. So sometimes there's just an amnesty, either a de jure amnesty that's written into law, or a de facto amnesty, which means that people more or less accept that there won't be any accountability. They won't pass a law, but it's going to be the understanded way of doing things between parties. So that's one thing. Impunity is often one of the carrots that you get to join negotiations in the first place. The other thing to bear in mind is that when you have power sharing agreements, all of these factions ultimately begin to control ministries. So they control the police, they control the army, they control the institutions of justice, which makes it very easy for them to avoid any form of accountability because they effectively control the judiciary. And that's one of the reasons why transitions from war to peace are a little bit different to post-authoritarian transitions. In post-authoritarian transitions, the outgoing regime don't really control the institutions of justice, but they do control the army and can reverse the transition. With peace, the bad guys often, or people who've committed human rights abuses, actually become part of the government and they move into power and have the ability to resist accountability. Is everyone clear on this notion, this clash of paradigms? Does it make sense to people? Sue, you're nodding. Does it make...
Yeah, it does make sense to me.
Go, okay.
Yes.
Go on.
because, like you said, when it comes to the power sharing agreement, it depends on who are in that agreement. So, but I'm not sure whether in a power sharing agreement do people get like 50% of the power, or is it like the government gets like 70% of the power and the rebels get like 30%. If that's the case, the government may want accountability, like they might want to prosecute the rebels for what they've done. But if it's a 50% power, then there won't be anything achieved.
Okay, yeah, you're right, but even if it's 70-30, the chances are there won't be any accountability, because the rebels, even if the rebels leave the government and it collapses, you could have a war again. I mean, there's always that danger. You could be right, and obviously the more power the government has, it may be inclined to pursue accountability. But it won't pursue accountability often it won't pursue accountability for its own forces. It'll be the rebels only. But that's a good point. Were you going to say something? No, sorry. Does someone have their hand up? No. Okay. Is it a sacrifice worth making? Is giving up on the notion of accountability a sacrifice that's worth making to secure a viable power sharing agreement?
I'd say from the point of government, yes, because as we mentioned before, their primary concern is survival.
Okay.
So from that point of view, of course.
What about from the victim's point of view, or from the international community's point of view, or the point of view of the average man on the street?
Or from the point of view.
Or from your point of view?
Well, let's put it from the point of view of the international community. Please go back to the example of Argentina. They were shaking their finger at Argentina and not taking into consideration the effects that sort of appeasing forces had for the maintaining of peace. So the international community will always shake their finger, never be fully happy, regardless of what. From the point of view of the victims, it's kind of a balancing act of, would you like to be involved in a war for X amount of years, or, do you want peace?
Yeah, okay. David, I'll come back to that point in a second.
Kind of similar, just this issue of stalemate, isn't it? It's kind of a utilitarian approach, isn't it? But trying to do the best thing for the most amount of people. So it's kind of like, do you want to present a government that's consolidated and try and govern the nation, even if it is under a power sharing agreement, rather than a conflict that might continue for years and years because they're not able to come to it.
Absolutely. Okay, yes, so you see, again, the word used utilitarian, actually, I haven't used that myself, but that's actually a very good way of thinking about justice policy and these things. People are always trying to reach that policy that makes the most sense and has the best outcomes for the most people. But if you go back to the article find out the international community and what they want, one of the things we see in the article by Band Against Enswearing is you have this clash of paradigms. You have these two things that the international community seem to insist upon, but they contradict each other. The international community comes together and tries to bring sides together in power sharing. The international community is very supportive of power sharing. The Geneva peace talks for Syria, the Colombian peace talks, all of them were based on some form of power sharing, be it political, territorial, or military power sharing. But at the same time, they're insisting on criminal accountability or truth commissions or reparations as well. And you often can't reconcile those two demands, because part of one of the fundamental reasons why groups will agree to engage in power sharing is so that they can secure impunity for themselves. So one of the things that we should be seeing is that the international community seems to be making mutually impossible demands on post-conflict countries when we come to that. And if you look at it from victims, as Darren was saying, there is this... People have to bear in mind, like, do victims have an interest in seeing prosecutions for what happened in the past, or should the overriding interest be to ensure that there aren't any more victims in future? And that's sort of the dilemma that they often have to deal with.
Did you also say that victims can be classified into groups? Firstly, victims as somebody that's been physically and mentally abused as a result of the war, or a victim, or somebody who's lost family, or victims in somebody who's been living under sort of a situation of war. It's like, and so one type of victim will seek one type of justice and the other one will seek peace.
Yep.
So how do you balance their interests as well?
I mean, it comes down to an individual decision in every individual case. One thing we can say, I suppose, is that the international community seems to be making mutually incompatible demands of the societies in question, and the victims themselves may have mutually incompatible desires. Some victims or members of the public will place an overriding premium on the cessation of hostilities. The single most important thing to them is that nobody gets killed or maimed or tortured in future. For other victims, it will be of fundamental importance that those things that actually have happened in the past are addressed. And this is one of the things you'll have to think about when you're doing your assessment for this, or if you do a dissertation in this at a later point. Whose point of view is most important to you? Is it the victims? Is it the government? Is the victims who've got an interest in justice? Is it a government who's interested in stability? Is it rebels whose interest is in stability? Is it the international community who have these mutually incompatible objectives, particularly in peace agreements? And again, I'm not going to tell you whose point of view you think should be the most important, but this is the sort of thing you should start thinking about. Do you take the point of view of a small number of victims who are actually physically tortured, who suffered abuses? Do you take the position of the average members of the public who just want repression or the war to end and aren't particularly bothered about accountability? Do you start from the point of view of the government, or do you start from the point of view of the international community as the guarantors of humanity as a whole's interests?
Surely as a starting point, you've got to take into account the people who've been adapted to the victims, like the direct victims of sort of the abuses. Surely as a starting point, their concerns got to be, you've got to work from there towards something that's reasonable and works for everyone.
But do you? I mean, if you listen to the... Go on, yeah.
That's not for the greater good of the
Yeah, that's what
majority
people,
of the
it's got to be a
population.
starting point.
I'd say that should be a secondary factor. I think you should look at what would be better for the majority of the country, which logically would be peace, and then from there you should be seeking a way to appease the minority, which I would presume would be the victims.
That has to be a set. If you can prosecute people for the crimes that they've committed without ensuring like a greater social harm, then that has to be a starting point, surely.
But you never know this. Like you exist in conditions of uncertainty. Unless a government has been completely toppled or defeated in a war, you don't know as a matter of certainty that you can prosecute them without...
As a theoretical, as a very starting point, you have to work from that point, surely.
Okay, so you think that you start from the
yeah, I mean, that's never going to be possible in pretty much every situation, but there has to be a theoretical standpoint from which you work out something that is greater for the social good and works for everyone.
Okay, but Dart is arguing that other people, there may be a majority in the community who don't have any strong particular interest in accountability, but do have a very strong interest in stability. If there's peace, they can rebuild their lives.
Because you'll never prosecute if there's not peace and stability. Like, who will you prosecute? There needs to be an overarching sense of peace that covers the entire community, because victims also have an interest of having peace, whereas a non-victim, well, what use is it to them if they start prosecuting people left, right and centre, if they still live in a state of instability?
What do you think, Sue? Are you siding with anyone with this? Or anyone else with
Well, I was just going to say, maybe sort of going back to that ethics of responsibility versus ethics of conviction, and those kind of like...
Okay, well, how we're seeing is very much a sort of an ethics of conviction.
I'm completely concerned with the ethics of responsibility. I don't think the ethics of conviction is of any use at all, morally.
But when we talk about the ethic of conviction, I think what Zalakris means by it is, again, an overriding concern with the desires of victims. I mean, that's when he's talking about the absolute duty of accountability that you owe to victims or to the rule of law. That seems to be more, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that seems to be where you're going.
Surely, if you could achieve that and have the greater social good, then that's the ethical responsibility. That's better for everyone.
Okay,
people can be convicted for crimes and and still maintain sort of peace and stability. And although it's never going to happen, that has to be a starting point.
It has happened somewhere, East Timor or the Balkans. I mean, that has happened. Sometimes people have absolutely prioritised accountability. But they were in situations where you could be very, very certain that it wasn't going to fundamentally destabilise the country. That's not always going to be the case. But I mean, sometimes people do take victims absolutely into account, and they do it. It's just not in all situations. But what you're arguing for does happen sometimes. Right.
Isn't the reason why there's this argument is why Weber says that the two are not in contrast. Ethics of responsibility and ethics of convictions are not in contrast at all, but they should supplement each other. So if what he's saying is an ethics of conviction, that it cannot be looked at in isolation or in contrast to what she's saying as an ethic of responsibility, and that the best governments or politicians are ones who have achieved a sense of using them to supplement each other. So I don't think it's sort of viable to look at an ethics of conviction or looking at accountability and punishment by itself. If that happens, then there's going to be consequences. And if you also look at peace by itself for the greater good, there's also going to be consequences to that. So I would agree with Gordon and say that there should be a supplement.
Right, a good fight was breaking out there, and you ruined it by pulling the two positions together. Go on.
The thing about what I'm trying to, maybe I'm not explaining myself properly. What I'm trying to say is that sort of accountability, the consequences of accountability are obviously much greater than the consequences of not having accountability in a vacuum, and that has to be a starting point. And after that, we have to consider all the consequences that can arise from it, and then come to a conclusion.
Okay. Anyone else? Like we sort of have victims in one sense as a starting point, or average members of the public as the other. Would anyone else have a fundamentally different starting point? Some people argue the international community, like the international norms we have, should be the starting point. I'm not a strong believer in that position, but some people will argue it. Cal?
Well, I'd say it depends on the jurisdiction of the court or the forum where the complaint's made. If you're protecting a victim, then you have a particular forum for it. If you're protecting international law, then you have a forum for that.
Yeah, arguably. Yeah, well, if international criminal law worked more successfully, I suppose you'd have a point, or there would be a point. What about question 10? Was Colombia's, I spelled broad incorrectly, but was Colombia's broad amnesty deal a worthwhile trade-off for peace? I'm interested to see what you think about this. Like, was it, you had fairly broad-ranging accountability in Colombia. There'll be very little real accountability for FARC rebels or for government forces. Like, was the amnesty deal?
I think no, but under the circumstances, it's better than not doing it. The consequences are much better ending the civil war that's been going on since the 50s anyway.
Yeah.
Than sort of not ending it and having no accountability.
Okay, I mean there is an amnesty deal here, as it says it will apply to members of the country's military. It's not supposed to include those who've committed war crimes or human rights violations. But yeah, one of the reasons why the peace deal in Colombia collapsed at one point in the summer is because amnesty was very, very broad-ranging. In the case of a war that goes on for 50 years, is broad-ranging accountability a sacrifice worth making? Jess?
I don't know. I think if you're going to, it depends on what you want your ending outcome to be. If the ending outcome is just peace and nothing else, then yes, it is, because, you know, amnesty is one of the best ways to get at least both sides or all sides to come to the table and sort of try and work things out, because no one wants to go to prison. So, you know, if that threat's still there, then they're still going to fight. But I don't know necessarily about the longevity of it, whether or not people will want some sort of accountability, whether, you know, that will anger like other people. You know, it's difficult to say at the moment, but I do think it has been going on for, you know, not just decades but generations. You know, then amnesty is a good way of bringing people to the table, at the very least.
Okay, and arguably, I mean, the amnesty here, it's it's got distinct limitations. Certain types of crimes are excluded and things like that. It is worth bearing in mind that sometimes you can have an amnesty on paper that covers certain types of offences. They're called de jure amnesties. They're written into law. But de facto amnesties are also something that's worth bearing in mind. They are unspoken agreements not to go and prosecute or not to go and punish, which are certainly worth bearing in mind.
I was about to say that, just from what I've read now, 220,000 people have been killed over the 51 years that every United States, nearly 4,500 people per year.
Yep.
And if the peace agreement is going to stop those, additional 4,500 years, 4,500 people per year being killed, and like I said before, some of the crimes that have been excluded from the amnesty are massacres, sexual violence and kidnapping, which arguably are some of the most severe types of crimes. Well, I'd say it's definitely worth it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, and again, one of the points I suppose is that the thing that makes amnesty morally imperative, because it stops 4,000 people a year being killed, also makes it morally repugnant. The idea that you are letting people, effectively forgiving and forgetting the fact that 4,000 people a year were killed. But as you're saying, this seems to be quite a carefully tailored amnesty program. I'd be interested to see in 3 or 4 years' time if there are actually any prosecutions at all, because I strongly suspect there's both a de jure amnesty here and a de facto one that no one's talking about. I saw Brian and did as well. Saw someone else stand tonight and they just Brian.
Well, the law specifically says that it excludes war crimes or human rights violations. But then it also says that it is going to, amnesty law will apply to guerrilla fighters from prosecution for minor crimes. But I mean, a human rights violation is a human rights violation, whether it's occasioned by a minor crime or a major crime. So the fact that it uses such ambiguous language, I mean, what are they going to use to constitute minor crimes? But minor crimes could also still result in human rights violations. So like you did say, that it still can't be seen as a case of pardoning or absolving people of responsibility for human rights violations. Just by the fact that it says, okay, so if you're found guilty of a minor crime, you will be pardoned, but then still minor crimes can still result in human rights. So I find it quite troubling, ambiguous, and that's quite troubling.
Yeah, it's the terms of it are quite ambiguous. How it ultimately works out is quite ambiguous as well. We'll go and see. I mean, any international peace treaty now says that there provides amnesties, but they always say that war crimes and crimes against humanity are excluded. So no amnesty can ever cover these things in international law. But you often end up in a situation where you have a peace agreement where there's an amnesty and major international crimes can't be covered by it, but the government still doesn't go and prosecute them. What this amnesty is doing is basically saying that everything that isn't a gross human rights obligation, a gross human rights violation, to which an erga omnes duty to prosecute attaches, can be amnestied or pardoned. So it could be like something like burning someone's house to the ground, or even just killing one person.
That's a human rights violation.
Yeah, absolutely. But there are human rights obligations to which an absolute duty to prosecute attaches. Like killing one person in a war there isn't an absolute duty to prosecute it. Killing someone in the context of a crime against humanity or in the course of a genocide does attach an obligation to prosecute. So they're sort of drawing a distinction between those two. But ultimately the end may very well be the same. There will be no prosecutions in Colombia, or there will be very, very few. But again, if a Russian guy kills someone in eastern Ukraine at the moment, that in and of itself doesn't attach an obligation to prosecute in international criminal law. It's only if it occurs in the context of a broader crime against humanity or a broader genocide or a broader series of war crimes that there's an absolute duty to prosecute. So not everyone whose house gets burnt, or not every sexual assault, or not every murder that's occurred in the course of war or authoritarianism actually attaches a fundamental obligation under international law to prosecute. So that's one of the reasons why the amnesty says what it is. But as you say, it's very morally troubling. Okay, one of the choices of incoming democratic regimes is to do nothing. Okay, and that sounds strange, but it's a choice that the Tunisian government effectively made, that the Mozambique government made at the end of its civil war, that the democratizing Spanish government made in the 70s when it was taking power from the Franco regime. What would result if an incoming democratic government in a former dictatorship decided not to pursue justice at all and simply let sleeping dogs lie? What would that say about? Just what about it?
They'd lack legitimacy, wouldn't they?
Why would it lack legitimacy?
Because they're not doing nothing, they're just ignoring it. They're not like listening to the will of the people, they're not respecting that people that would be victims of human rights. Like violations.
But governments don't get legitimacy from one or two things. I mean, governments get legitimacy from keeping the trains running on time, from providing healthcare, from providing justice in the future, even if they don't produce it from the past. I mean, does the failure to pursue accountability absolutely strip a government of its legitimacy, which is it?
I don't think it absolutely does, but I think that it does morally, like on a moral level, because they haven't done nothing about this. They're just brushing it under the carpet, and if that dictator is still in the background, then he's still holding some power and some spectre of influence. So I think that affects it as well.
Okay, so it doesn't completely destroy legitimacy, but it does strip
It just like morally, I think, because it's not right.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's not a moral continuation of
Well, what about those Spaniards? What about the Spaniards and the Mozambicans? The Poles who never prosecuted people who committed crimes, under the communist regime. I mean, all these. Poland's a democracy now. Spain's a democracy now. Mozambique is, one of the fastest-growing democracies and economies in southern Africa. All these countries did absolutely nothing. What does that go on?
Do you think they have achieved national reconciliation? Like, even nothing happened about accountability. How do they feel about it? Like, that would be the question.
Well, there's very famous, in Spain, nobody ever talks, people only started talking about the Civil War in the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, literally, no one spoke about it for 20 years. In Mozambique, I know people who've gone into Mozambique to do interviews about transitional justice, and they've been chased out of towns because they're not supposed to talk about that sort of thing. So there's arguably no reconciliation either. But societies, this Mozambique, Spain, Poland, Czech Republic, all these places, they had very little in the way of criminal accountability or truth or anything like that. But they still...
Why did they decide to not do that? Did they have reasons to decide to not pursue accountability?
Well, it wasn't really a free choice. There's always this worry that peace in Mozambique could be reversed if you started prosecuting people who you need to, you have sort of power sharing, so you need them to keep their own troops in line. So if you prosecute them, you jeopardize the peace. In places like Eastern Europe, there was a worry perhaps that the state would stop being functional if you pursued accountability too far. In Spain, there was a worry that it might go back to civil war. It sounds ridiculous now, but in the 70s, people were actively worried about that. If you start prosecuting the army, they'd overthrow the state. So it's not like there was a conscious decision to pursue justice or not. Sometimes circumstances, go and do so. But it didn't prove fundamentally to undermine democracy.
I think I don't know, maybe would have hoped that they looked into it and they know that fear of maybe peace going is well founded, and that obviously when you look back at it now, it did look like significant peace is still there. But you like saying that at the time maybe they were thinking, oh well, looking at the whole picture of everything, kind of making the decision that there's no point in pursuing anything because there's a greater risk. I know you kind of said of anything that's going on, but looking at kind of the attitudes of people in the country and the attitudes of everyone involved, and just I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. But again, Britain, right? The IRA killed loads of people in London. In Warrington in the 90s, they killed a 3 or 4 year old boy. Is there anyone from Warrington here? No, there's. But anyway, there was no accountability, whatsoever for any of those crimes. So I mean, we talk about democracy being some sort of partly legitimate if they don't go and punish people. But history seems to suggest to us that countries just move on. It's a matter of great concern at a time, but they keep going. Kaya, you were going to say something?
I agree with I agree with you because it's all like maybe not all, but it mainly depends on the society, what the society wants. Because when it comes to examples in Europe, Poland, maybe they never prosecute anybody, but like the society wanted to kind of move on with that. And also, like a lot of, like as I said now, older people, they as you said, they just want to upkeep the peace, just keep the peace, not necessarily the justice.
Absolutely. That's the other thing again that we keep forgetting, but it's worth bearing in mind that some people will be very supportive of the idea of letting sleeping dogs lie. You know, you get very few regimes outside of like North Korea that are uniformly. Well, even North Korea is probably fairly popular with lots of North Koreans. There's very few governments that are absolutely completely unpopular. They will always have supporters within the population. So for many people, the idea of punishing people for doing things that were perfectly legal at the time under domestic law is in itself something that could strip a government of legitimacy.
Well, I agree with Rebecca about the whole aspect of moral bankruptcy that exists. What I'd like to add is even when governments are doing nothing in terms of transitional justice, maybe they're going through internal processes of an administrative change or a legislative change or a legal change internally, which does not in any way amount to accountability or towards, providing certain solace to victims of certain crimes. But at the end of the day, there is a transformation, and that's what we're looking at in the long term, to build a stable society which will not repeat mistakes of the past.
Absolutely. Again, that goes back to the notion we were discussing a little bit last week. The idea that transitional justice is just the tip of a very big iceberg. As you say, there's so many other things going on. The civil service is changing, the judiciary is changing, public attitudes are changing. There are so many other things going on at the end of a war, a period of authoritarianism, that there's a big danger with this class in particular, just because we're so focused on transitional justice, that we elevate the importance of it. There are so many other things going on all the time. Army reform, police reform, civil service reform, new laws, human rights ombudsman being formed, women's rights, human rights, civil rights, that we shouldn't exaggerate the importance of the things we're discussing here. They're not the only thing that counts towards the legitimacy of a government, though they are, as Jessica says, very important.
But also the danger in sort of letting sleeping dogs lie could possibly be that action to let the sleeping dogs lie could act as a trigger at some point in the future for degeneration into war. And just the fact that we're talking about Mozambique as having sort of emerged as a peaceful democracy when sleeping dogs were let lie, I mean, that is also a question of time, for example. If a war was occasioned because there's a lot of polarization of different ethnic groups, and then there is a transitional government that comes in and then does not look into what was causing that polarization, it could very, very easily act as a trigger in the future if there are similar circumstances. For example, if two ethnic communities go into war during an election, and the government comes in and lets that lie at the next election, which happens 5 years or 10 years in the future, could possibly very well be a trigger. So I wouldn't be 100% in support of letting sleeping dogs lie just because there could be unresolved skeletons there that could trigger another war.
Okay, you're making deterrence-based arguments, which is what we'll be looking at in a few weeks' time. But yeah, I mean, one of the very things that people say is that if you don't prosecute or find out truth now, you're just postponing the danger for 10 or 20 years. It's definitely something we'll be looking at. Kaya, you can have the last word, and then I want to say a little bit about next week's seminar.
Just to add to my point before I used to one development. In case of, again, Poland, they never made prosecute anybody, but we had something like illustrated commissions.
Yes, purges of the civil service, yeah.
I mean, we didn't do it as soon as possible after the change, after the transition, but it's still happening. There are still, maybe not commission, but there are still politicians that say, oh, this person, done 30 years ago did this, and these people are still alive, and they try to, make them accountable for what they did, 30 years ago, and it's still kind of in the society, maybe they never prosecute anybody, but it's still, some people just still seeking justice, but it's, really random, and it depends on what parties, currently in the government.
Yeah, absolutely. For some people, the search for justice, it never ends. Governments change, society moves on, but if you're a victim, or it's 30 or 40 years later, it's still something that's very active in your mind. We'll skip the last question. What are the alternatives to, if a state decides not to pursue justice? We'll come to some of those alternatives, like reparations and truth commissions. Is this class working in the sense? Are people happy with the question-based discussion, or do people want something else? Or Alex is going to run the classes slightly different. We're going to have a bit of variety in how they're running. So Alex is going to leave instructions about how the class is going to operate next week or the week after. He'll put them up on Vital. But I think there'll be presentations more so than sort of an open-ended questions and answer session. So we can come back and discuss what people are happy with. But some of you will have to do a presentation, I think, next week or the week after. So just be prepared for that. So let's see how these things are working. Alex is going to, you'll get to meet him next week. He's going to put the material for the next seminar online, and I'm sure he'll explain how the seminar is going to work next week. But if you've got any questions, feel free to email me or to email him. And with that, yeah, I'll let you go. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to come up and talk to me after. But I'll see you all. This was a very good seminar, by the way, and I'll see you all in 2 or 3 weeks. I can't remember when I'm back, but Alex will be here next week.